Hi, and welcome to another edition of Jules Voto's Photo Focus. In this video, I'm going to be talking about the 5 biggest advantages mirrorless cameras have over DSLRs. Now, I started in photography over 50 years ago with a manual focus 35mm camera that had no built-in meter. Then I went to a camera with a meter. Then eventually went to an automatic camera, the Nikon F3, which had an automatic exposure control. Then, of course, when autofocus came out, I bought an autofocus camera. And when we went to digital, when digital became popular, a DSLR. And finally, about 5 years ago, a mirrorless camera. So all those cameras were improvements over the previous generation of cameras. And I just think that mirrorless cameras are the best of them all. So I just want to go over those 5 big advantages that I think mirrorless cameras have over DSLRs. Now, some of you may disagree, and that's fine. This is what I think. This is for the type of work that I do. I feel that these are huge advantages of mirrorless cameras, and although I still use a Nikon D810 DSLR, which I love for certain types of photography, the DSLRs overall are the most versatile and just fit my needs perfectly. So let me go through this list and let me know what you think. Leave a comment in the comments below with your opinion. I value your opinion. I respect your opinion. I don't think that what I feel is right for everyone, but so let me just go through this list. And from the point of view of a photographer myself that does a lot of event photography and portrait and headshot photography. So number one, and these are not going to be in any particular order, okay? I really can't rate them 1 through 5, but these are just my 5 biggest advantages. The EVF. Now, I know some people don't like EVFs. I have no problem with them, and they have one huge advantage over a DSLR. As I said, I do event photography, and sometimes you're in a dark ballroom or a dark conference hall. And with the EVF, you could see. With a DSLR, I recently did a graduation for a hospital, the resident graduation, and the room wasn't that bright, and I had my son with me. He was using a DSLR, my D810, I was using the Z8, and I took a few pictures with the D810, and it was like night and day, and you could barely see through the viewfinder of the DSLR. Now, I never noticed that before I went to mirrorless, but with the mirrorless camera, it just brought everything to life. You could see so much better. Using flash in a dark environment, you just have so much more vision. You could put the focus point exactly where you want it, where sometimes with the DSLR, you have trouble seeing. You have trouble seeing the expression. Now, we were using on the DSLR a 24 to 120 f4, so it wasn't the brightest aperture. And, with a 1.4 lens, you're going to see a little brighter through the viewfinder of a DSLR. But I think that is a huge advantage of the mirrorless camera, that it's so much easier to see what you're photographing. Okay, also, silent operation. I recently did the 25th anniversary mass for a priest. He had been a priest 25 years. I did his first mass 25 years ago, and then celebrating his 25th anniversary. And there are some solemn moments during the Mass. I was in the center aisle, low. I was kneeling down. And you don't want to hear the slapping mirror of a DSLR or a film camera at those quiet moments in the service. And the Z8 with the 70 to 200, completely silent operation. The autofocus, you hear nothing. The shutter, of course, it's an electronic shutter, so there's no noise at all. I wasn't using flash, just shooting by available light at fairly slow shutter speeds, and it was no disruption whatsoever. Nobody gave me a dirty look that hearing that camera, hearing that mirror and that shutter, because there was no sound. So I think that is a huge advantage. Also, I do some work for a cardiology group, and they have conferences, educational conferences for doctors. And there's speakers at the podium, a room full of people, and not like a mass, but still, you don't want to be a distraction. And with a completely silent camera, silent autofocus, you can do that. And I think that's a big advantage. Also, the viewfinder, again, going back to the viewfinder, is what you see is what you get. And you can see before exposure approximately what that finished image is going to look like. So you can make adjustments in exposure, you can make adjustments in white balance, and get it right before you press the shutter release. And I think that is a huge advantage to the mirrorless camera. And also in the viewfinder, you can have a live histogram, which can indicate your exposure. And I think that is a huge advantage. So I think it has it all over a DSLR, because with a DSLR, yes, you can see the result, but you can't see before you press the shutter release. That's really important to me. And it's also what you get used to. My first car had nothing. It didn't even have air conditioning. And, my next car had power windows. I could never go back to a car without power windows and, and other features. So once you get used to it, you can't live without it. So I really love the viewfinder, the electronic viewfinder on the mirrorless cameras. Okay. You can adapt most lenses to a mirrorless camera. There's a short flange distance, the distance from the back of the lens to the sensor. Because of that, you can get an adapter to adapt almost any lens. I have old manual focus lenses from Minolta and Canon and Pentax and Olympus that easily mount with an inexpensive adapter to my mirrorless cameras. So that enables me to experiment with these lenses, to pick them up really cheap. Some of these lenses I got for $15, $20. And it's really a lot of fun, and it makes for some interesting images, because all these images have their unique qualities, and you could play around with them. I've done videos on that, on these manual focus lenses. And it just works out great. They're easy to focus on the mirrorless camera. And, just going back real quick, back to the EVF, I know some people say that it's not as good as an optical viewfinder. I have no issue whatsoever. In fact, I even forget that it's a video image. I really don't have an issue with it at all. I know with some of the earlier mirrorless cameras, there may have been some issues with the EVF, but I have no issues with it at all. Now, one more thing concerning adapting lenses. There's one type of lenses that can be adapted, will focus manually, will work with all the exposure controls, but won't autofocus, and those are the screw drive lenses, because there's no autofocus motor in the mirrorless camera. It's in the lens, and a lens that requires, an autofocus lens that requires a motor in the camera, well, you're just not going to have that with the mirrorless camera, so you have to focus them manually. So if you have a bunch of those old screw drive lenses, then, and you want to autofocus them, then you're going to need a DSLR. At least with Nikon, at least when it comes to Nikon. the autofocus. With a mirrorless camera, you have almost 100% coverage in the viewfinder. With the DSLR, with a full-frame DSLR, your autofocus sensors are only in the central area. So that is an advantage. And the subject detection. You could set your mirrorless camera to detect birds, animals, people, airplanes, vehicles. It is just, that's something you did not have with the DSLR. The autofocus on some of the higher end DSLRs was great, but the mirrorless cameras are better. And it's important to get exposure right, of course. But if you have an out of focus image, you might as well just toss it. And so with the mirrorless camera, you're going to get a much higher percentage of in-focus images because of the fantastic autofocus systems we have today in our mirrorless cameras. So I would never want to go back to a DSLR for any sports that I shoot, for birds in flight, things like that, action. They are just superior. So those are my 5 biggest advantages of a mirrorless camera over a DSLR. And like I said, I would not go back for general photography, for most of what I do, to a DSLR. The Nikon D810, for me, for studio type portraits, works out fine, and I still use it for that. But for just about everything else, in my opinion, the mirrorless camera is superior, and I would never go back to a DSLR for those types of situations. So let me know what you think. I value your opinions. I respect your opinions, as I said earlier. If a DSLR works for you, great. If a film camera works better for you for some reason, that's great too. It's wonderful today that we have so many choices. We have more choices than we've ever had before. It's a good time to be a photographer because of that. And you could always find a type of camera that works for you, whether it's going back to a single lens reflex 35mm camera from the 60s or the latest mirrorless camera. So I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, please give it a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel. I publish a new video every Monday morning and Wednesday morning at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. And again, if you have any questions or comments, or I just would like to hear your thoughts on this subject. I know it's a little bit controversial, I think, because there are still advocates, strong advocates for the DSLR, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. So that's it, and I will talk to you soon.